In a listening station in northern Italy, late on November 28, 1960, two brothers pressed their headphones tight against their ears as a faint Morse code signal, an SOS, desperately taps out from the edge of space before fading into silence. This single ghostly transmission would become the cornerstone of a dark legend, that before Yuri Gagarin became a global hero, a generation of phantom cosmonauts were sacrificed, their catastrophic deaths erased from history by a totalitarian state obsessed with victory. The story of the 20th century was the story of the Cold War, a conflict fought not just with armies but with ideology and propaganda. The ultimate high ground was space. For the Soviet Union, a regime built on the myth of proletarian perfection, being first was a political necessity. Every launch, every orbit was a demonstration of communist superiority, but behind the Iron Curtain, this ambition came at a catastrophic cost. The pressure to beat the Americans was absolute. Schedules were pathologically aggressive, and the state's control over information was total. In this crucible of paranoia and ambition, failure was not an option, and when it inevitably occurred, it wasn't documented. It was buried. The first whispers of a secret history came in 1959. A high-ranking Czech communist allegedly leaked information about a series of failed suborbital ballistic flights. The names of the dead pilots, Alexei Ledovskik, Andrei Mitkov, Serenti Shaborin, were reported in the Italian press. They were ghosts, men with no official records. These reports were just tremors before the earthquake. The epicenter of the legend was a homemade listening post in a converted German bunker called Torre Bert. There, two former medical students, Achille and Giovanni Battista Judica-Cordiglia, used a web of antennas to eavesdrop on the heavens. What they claimed to have recorded was a chronicle of Soviet disaster. The November 1960 SOS was just the beginning. In February 1961, just 2 months before Gagarin's celebrated flight, they recorded something far more disturbing. For several minutes, their equipment captured the faint but unmistakable sound of a human heartbeat and labored, frantic breathing from within a space capsule, a biological signal that grew weaker and weaker until it stopped completely. 3 months later, in May 1961, another transmission. This time, a woman's voice, panicked and desperate, piercing the static from orbit. Her message was a string of terrified exclamations. As her capsule allegedly began to burn up on a failed re-entry, "I am hot," she cried out in Russian. "I see a flame." Then, only silence. The brothers' archive of horror continued to grow. They recorded what they claimed was a Soviet ground control team chastising a cosmonaut couple inside a capsule that had catastrophically overshot its orbital path with a final ominous message from mission control. It simply stated conditions were about to get worse. Each recording was another name, another ghost to add to the list of the lost. But the most detailed and damning story did not come from a ghostly radio transmission. It centered on a single man, Vladimir Ilyushin. Ilyushin was Soviet royalty, the son of the USSR's most famous aircraft designer. He was a celebrated test pilot, a hero of the Soviet Union. According to the legend, he was also the true first man in orbit. The story, first broken by a British journalist, was surgically precise. On April 7, 1961, a full 5 days before Gagarin, Ilyushin was launched into space, completing 3 full orbits of the Earth. But a catastrophic failure in the re-entry system sent his capsule off course, instead of landing to the hero's welcome planned in Kazakhstan. He crashed violently in mainland China. He survived but was horribly injured and disfigured. For the Kremlin, a successful launch but a failed recovery was a public relations disaster. It punctured the myth of perfection. So, the state security apparatus, the KGB, allegedly enacted a ruthless contingency plan. They retrieved Ilyushin from China, hiding him in a Moscow hospital. They then sent up the backup, a charismatic and photogenic pilot named Yuri Gagarin, and classified the original mission at the highest level. Ilyushin, the true pioneer, was erased. The story was almost too perfect, a cinematic tale of heroism, failure, and a callous cover-up. For years it was held up as the ultimate proof, But the core of the mystery always returned to that concrete bunker in Italy, to the two brothers and their magnetic tapes. The Judica-Cordiglia brothers were not frauds. They were meticulous, obsessive radio amateurs who documented their work with scientific rigor. They were not seeking fame, but were pulled into a story far larger than they could have imagined. Their recordings gave the legend its voice and its heartbeat, its final terrified breaths. They made the conspiracy feel viscerally, terrifyingly real, providing the human element to a story of state-sponsored lies. And yet, for every piece of evidence, a counter-explanation exists. The truth, as it often is buried in nuance. The Ilyushin story was a fabrication. He was a real pilot, and he was indeed seriously injured in 1961, but not from a space crash. He was in a car accident. The story was a sensational scoop, perhaps even deliberate Western disinformation that spiraled into legend. The Soviets even presented Ilyushin to the public to debunk it. The Judica-Cordiglia recordings are more complex. Experts noted their equipment, while impressive, had no way to accurately track or verify the origin of a signal. The frantic breathing could have been a stressed pilot during a high-altitude balloon test. The woman's voice burning on re-entry had linguistic errors. The SOS signals and telemetry data they intercepted were likely real, but they belonged to the vast constellation of unmanned Soviet probes and satellite launches. In the profound silence of the Cold War, it was easy to mistake the ghost of a machine for the ghost of a man. The specific stories of the Lost Cosmonauts were almost certainly myths, but that is not the end of the story, because the paranoia that fueled the legend, the deep-seated belief that the Soviet regime would sacrifice its own and erase them from history, was entirely justified. The proof is a name, Mitrofan Nedelin. On October 24, 1960, on a secret launch pad at Baikonur, the heart of the Soviet space program, the prototype of a new R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile was being prepared for its first test. The program was behind schedule. Marshal Nedelin, commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces, was personally on site, pushing his teams to cut corners and ignore safety protocols. When a short circuit ignited the second stage engine, the fully fueled rocket became a colossal bomb. The explosion was instantaneous and absolute. Over 100 of the Soviet Union's top scientists, engineers, and military personnel were incinerated where they stood. Marshal Nedelin himself was vaporized. All that was ever found was his watch, fused to a piece of melted metal. It was one of the worst disasters in the history of space exploration, and the Soviet Union buried it completely. The families were told their loved ones had died in a plane crash. The media reported nothing. The state's wall of silence was absolute. The truth of the Nedelin catastrophe was not officially acknowledged by Moscow until 1989, nearly 3 decades later. This is the crucial legacy. The USSR proved it was not only capable but ruthlessly efficient at erasing its most catastrophic failures. And so, the legend of the Lost Cosmonauts endures. It persists, not because the evidence is sound, but because its central premise is true. It serves as a powerful allegory for the human cost of a totalitarian state's ambition. The ghosts of Shaborin, Ledovskik, and the nameless woman burning in the atmosphere may be fictional, but they represent the very real ghosts of countless scientists, soldiers, and citizens who were sacrificed and forgotten. The legend is a monument to the victims of a system that valued the victory of the state over the lives of its people. It is a grim reminder that the darkest secrets of history are often hidden not in what is recorded, but in the deafening silence that follows a catastrophe.